Right Voices interview series with C3 Solutions. I'm Nick Loris, the Vice President of Public Policy at C3, and today I'm excited to be joined by Secretary David Bernhardt. Mr. Bernhardt has served several roles in the Department of Interior, beginning in George W. Bush's presidency, served as Deputy Secretary of the Interior in the Trump administration beginning in July of 2017, became Acting Secretary in January 2019, and was confirmed as Secretary a few months later for the duration of the Trump administration's term. So suffice it to say, he has a deep knowledge of the issues and also the inner workings of the department. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us, Secretary.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I hope life outside of government is treating you well. And I'd like to take this time today to look back at what you've accomplished, but also comment on several actions the Biden administration has taken thus far. But before we get into some of the policy specifics, I wanted to ask more of a kind of table setting question. Being at the helm of a department that manages about 1/5 of the land in the United States, not to mention the outer continental shelf and subsurface minerals, that's land that spans across states with competing interests as well as varying economic and environmental objectives. So under your leadership, what were your guiding principles for managing the department?
Well, you first begin with the fact that Congress has really set the table for you as an administrator of a government agency. Congress has laid down the law, and in Interior's case, there's a whole plethora of statutes that suggest that and direct that land of different types be managed in different ways, that the regulatory provisions for certain things are spelled out very clearly. And as a result of that, really, you take the parameters from the U.S. Congress and the law, and then you overlay that to the extent that you can provide it, you overlay that with the president's policy vision, whatever that is. But that vision has to be consistent with the law, and your actions need to be consistent with the law. And then you, as an administrator, have to evaluate the facts of the situation and make the best determination you can on those facts of what you think in your judgment is the best thing, and then articulate your decision in a way that's rational so it will stand up to scrutiny. And so my belief is that as long as an administrator is following the oath that he or she took, which is to faithfully execute the law well, within the sideboards that Congress has provided, as long as you're not arbitrary, you can do what the president would prefer as consistent with the law.
Yeah, thank you for that. It sounds simple, but not always carried out in certain agencies and in certain administrations, so I appreciate that. Can you speak to the importance of cooperative federalism when you were secretary? I know Interior is a little bit different than an agency like the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, where states are administering grant programs, but Interior has so much interaction with states and localities and private landowners. So how did that interaction work, and how should it work?
Well, I believe that it begins with a position of mutual respect and comity. It is followed up by regular conversations with governors and the secretary, whoever the secretary is. I worked for 3 secretaries and obviously served as secretary myself. And I think for all of them and most of their predecessors or successors, the relationship one has with the governors is important. You're not always going to agree on your policy objectives, and obviously you approach things from differing interests. But at the end of the day, species know no boundaries. The changes in the environment know no boundaries. And so the concept that Interior or any federal agency that manages land could work in a manner that's not collaborative and cooperative is really counterproductive, I think, to achieving the outcomes, whether they're economic outcomes or environmental outcomes. There's a lot more common ground than is seen in the newspapers between members of various governorships and secretaries of the interior. There's lots of collaboration, and there are roles where states really provide the lead. You know, if you look at the Colorado River water system, what you'd see is that 7 states have really led in the exercise of the management of that river, even though for the lower Colorado, the Secretary of the Interior has tremendous jurisdiction. The collaboration of the 7 states for over 70 years has been what's kept that river system really free of caustic litigation, and it's a good example of how states can work collaboratively with the department.
Yeah, that's a great example, and it segues into another big conversation that the Department of Interior is having right now, which is 30 by 30, an environmental proposal by the Biden administration to conserve 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And, you know, for some, that sounds great. For others, they may be reflexively concerned about the federal government accruing more property and this being a lands grab. And so I wanted to get your take, especially because the 24-page document that was released by the Department of Interior earlier this month or maybe last month outlines 8 principles. And at face value, they look very consistent with kind of that conservative mentality of environmental stewardship, including things like making sure that we are supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts and honoring private property rights and supporting voluntary stewardship efforts of private property owners. So I was curious if you had a chance to take a look at that document and what were your overall impressions?
So I think, first off, I would say the document is a great document to read. And I think what you said about items 1 through 8, you know, if you look at them through a particular lens, they could have come from Ryan Zinke or Deb Haaland. But what really matters is what are the details of those policies and plans. And, you know, the 30 by 30 idea begins with a definition of what's protected that U.S. Geological Survey said is like 12% of federal lands. And so that, if that's the case, then there's going to be some challenges to 30 by 30. If it is more aligned with working lands, with multiple use lands, with state lands that are being utilized in various ways, it could be a different thing. And so, you know, what's troubling here is on one hand, you have an undefined document, and on the other, you have some real activists taking leadership roles within the Department of the Interior who have for a long time espoused, you know, relatively radical thinking from Earth First and others. And so, you know, what is ultimately going to be at issue here is not what they say in their first document, but what does this really begin to look like? And is it something that ranchers and county commissioners and governors can look at and say, oh, this is eminently workable, or is it something much different? And I think we're at a point in time where no one can tell you with definity which of those things it's going to be. And as a result, there are those that have historic concerns, and they're going to be a little reticent to embrace something until they have greater definition. And, you know, there's a question as to whether that lack of definition is deliberate until you're down the road a while. And so we still have a lot to see before that policy is one that you can embrace or push back against.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's spot on. And especially that point about, you know, keeping working lands working. And I think one of the actions that many people have been discouraged by, particularly out west, has been the Biden administration's decision to prohibit new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters. And certainly that affects the Gulf Coast the longer this lasts as well, which you're the lawyer, so I don't know if we want to get into whether it's a violation of the Federal Land Policy Management Act or not, but could you expound on kind of just generally what these consequences mean for the people in the states in which they rely on energy production, for their economy, for jobs, for revenues for the states, and what also it might mean for tackling maintenance issues at our national parks, since one of the crowning achievements of the previous administration was passing the Great American Outdoors Act?
Well, first off, I think it's important to recognize that that given the reach the federal government has in terms of the scope of the land that it does manage, both at Interior and other agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, together, those federal agencies have activities that take place on them that really create the hopes and dreams of entire communities. Entire communities depend on natural resource development activities, things that take place, even recreational activities that take place on federal land. So any dramatic change to modify those practices, like just simply saying carte blanche, we will not do oil and gas leasing in the future, has a tremendous impact. And where I grew up in Rifle, Colorado, a community surrounded by federal lands, severance taxes from development of federal resources was very important in terms of our hospital funding, our school funding, education funding, road funding in a state like Wyoming. And so when you look at the amount of money that is shared between states and onshore and the federal government with each lease sale, it begins to be quite significant. I mean, I think in 2018, we at the Department of the Interior essentially sent the state of New Mexico $1 billion from leasing revenue, and so that's a big effect to these local communities and states. But it's not only the immediate dollar effect that matters, but it's also frustrating, their opportunities going forward, and that is a very significant thing. And what I believe is interesting is that, we have all sorts of regulatory mechanisms to ensure that before we make a decision, we have really thought through the environmental consequences of that decision. And what I think is interesting here is, there is not a clear substitute for a lot of the economic activity that comes from leasing. And so if you're going to say we're not going to do it anymore, I think it's really harmful to not have an alternative that is viable and ready to be applied to these communities. And frankly, in some communities, the alternative might simply not exist. Even the conservative New York Times this weekend has a series of a story regarding like the benefits that might flow from certain renewable activities and how they line up in accord with economic activities from other types of economic activity. And it's not certain. A mine in a community like Western Colorado or Wyoming can have long-standing jobs for a very long period of time. And if you go back and look, the government made a bargain with the people in these communities, and they basically said, come out and settle, and we'll manage this land for multiple uses. So if we're going to change that, my view is that's something that Congress really should do, and make the decision of what they want to do, rather than the stroke of a pen by a secretary or a president.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, it's as you mentioned, these are multiple use lands. It's hard to just strip away something that has been so important for these states' economies, but also for their localities, for their public activities, whether that's funding for schools and hospitals, and also for conservation efforts too. And I do think there's a tremendous opportunity for renewable energy production on federal lands too. And I think one of the common sources of frustration for conventional sources and renewable sources alike has been some of these unnecessarily long and burdensome environmental reviews and permitting processes. And I know at DOI, you've seen firsthand where there are opportunities to modernize and accelerate environmental reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, while still maintaining that there are environmental standards in place, but allowing projects to move forward in a timely process. Can you share some of the breakdowns you've seen in that NEPA process and why it got to be so long? Because I remember a few years ago, you led a workshop with a bunch of the think tanks around DC and talked about how the NEPA process kind of grew to be as onerous and burdensome as it had become until the Trump administration had made some improvements to it.
Well, it's one of the, first off, for those that don't know, the National Environmental Policy Act requires that for significant actions, the government go through a process of thinking about the potential consequences of a decision, soliciting input on those consequences, and considering a range of alternatives to that potential decision, and taking that information to make a more informed decision on whether they should proceed with the proposal or something different. And that applies. That process applies to renewable projects. It applies to conventional development projects. It applies to permits for ski areas or anything really that might have a significant effect. And I've always thought that fundamentally that act was a wonderful act from the perspective of we should be more informed before we make a decision, and fundamentally we should make better decisions based on that information. When I got to the Interior Department in 2017, what I found is we had decision documents that were tens of thousands of pages thick. And the reality was that years had been spent developing these documents, but decision makers weren't actually reading them. At the end of the day, it had become an exercise to throw a bunch of paper together to see if you could get through court. It wasn't serving the purpose that it had. And more importantly, what we found at Interior was that when a state office, like say a Colorado BLM office, sent a document to the Department of the Interior for review before it went to the Federal Register, it could sit 199 to 200 days just in a review process as people tried to figure out what they wanted to do with the decision. And I made a deal with the folks at BLM and the other agencies and basically said, look, we're going to work really hard to come up with documents that are readable. And by ensuring that they're readable, we'll ensure that the factors that should be considered are, and that we have a dialogue about how we should proceed with the project or not. And we did that, and it remarkably sped up the amount of time it took for these documents to be created. It didn't sacrifice any environmental consideration. And as a matter of fact, the Trump administration overall ended up changing their regulations in some ways modeled after what we were doing in Interior. I had career employees ask me when I came into the department and started looking at this, please give us a timeline, please give us page limitations. And we did that, and it made a difference. This administration has chosen to not only get rid of all of those proposals or those suggestions, but I add things as simple as please include the cost of the environmental compliance on the cover of each report so that people would know that, whatever the process was, it cost X. the Biden administration has chose to even eliminate that requirement. And what I think that is, on one hand, it will be counter to their own interests. They have an interest in a robust infrastructure plan, and I think they'll find that if they'd honed closer to our proposals, they'd have more expeditious development of their own activities. But my view was that we should fix the process for everybody, not merely for favored or disfavored entities, and have the process run its course. And the president was clear, President Trump at the time, that he's happy to make decisions of no as just as much as yes, but let's not keep projects in limbo for years and decades. It just seems completely inappropriate. And so my view is that you can change the processes without changing the environmental standards, and you can do a lot of good. And not everybody wants to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that breakdown of one, what NEPA is, but what you guys had accomplished at Interior. I think it's critically important, and especially as we talk about a big infrastructure bill, it's difficult to build back better with a lot of regulatory red tape and even meet a lot of these deep decarbonization efforts, whether you agree with them or not, with this amount of regulatory red tape. And even with something like wildfires, I know NEPA and, litigious organizations have been problematic for reducing the risk of wildfires. And we're in the thick of wildfire season right now. And I know the Forest Service is housed under the Department of Agriculture, but DOI has a critical role to play as well. So switching gears to wildfires a little bit, what did you guys do to reduce wildfire risk, and what would you recommend to this administration?
Well, I think one of the innovations that we put forward when I was secretary, and I felt really strongly about this, is no matter what your perspective on climate change is, no matter where you stand on forest management, I think we can all agree that wildfire frequency is increasing. The wildfire season has lengthened, and catastrophic wildfires are occurring more often, largely because of fuel load, but I'm not even asking you to agree to that. But here's what I proposed, and I think that this really is an idea that is important. For many, many years, we at Interior and the Forest Service have primarily used seasonal employees to fight the fires. And my suggestion was that we begin to re-engage the workforce at Interior and the Forest Service in a way that would create more year-round firefighters. And my theory on that was a couple-fold. A lot of times we are not as aggressive with fires as we might be because we're holding hours of our temporary workers back so that we have them at other points of the season. And I thought we needed to not be able to, we needed to find a way around that. And also that in the event that our full-time firefighters didn't have fires to fight, they could be redeployed to treat areas, because treatment really does have a very positive effect. And so my view was that we needed, given the change in the environment we're seeing, we needed to begin to change our workforce. And we put that forward. Congress looked at it, and I think the new administration is looking at it. I think it's very important to think through, just because we did something for 50 years one way, we need to think about how we do these things in the changing environment and do them in a way that makes sense and is responsible. There is no doubt that active management cuts down significantly on catastrophic wildfire. And we can utilize people that know what they're doing in this area to really ramp up. And I think that's what Congress and the administration should do over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I agree. And I think, in a lot of senses, those active and proactive management of forests generally bode pretty well for the general public, and for, ecologists on both the left and the right know that this needs to be part of the solution. So I appreciate that. I want to switch gears again to the Endangered Species Act, because last month the Biden administration announced its intent to revise or rescind regulations that would improve how agencies would implement ESA. And I think, in my opinion, better improve the incentive structure under what you did at the Department of Interior. So I was curious if you could kind of explain your approach into what the department did with respect to ESA and what concerns you may have should the Biden administration rescind or revise the improvements that y'all put in place.
So we really tried to look at the Endangered Species Act and say, hey, how could we make it work better while at the same time minimizing unneeded conflict. Congress is very clear that the Endangered Species Act law is here to stay. And my view was, let's figure out how to work it in a way that's optimal. So on the listing side of things, what we did is said, hey, when you're listing potentially listing a species, and that species is going to be threatened, we would follow a practice that the National Marine Fisheries Service has used for a long time, which is create a special rule for each threatened species, looking at how to ensure that our regulatory requirements are focused on those things that would make a difference for the species. So that was one of the first things that we went out with the rule and proposed. The other thing we did is said where there's going to be critical habitat designated, it needs to actually be habitat, and not just merely something that might be habitat someday, somewhere, in some place that we haven't figured out yet. And then we also said where agencies interact with the Service for Interagency Agreement, let's streamline and improve the way those interagency consultations take place, so there's less fighting about is the document right or wrong, and more clarity on focusing on, is the species going to be harmed or not, is habitat going to be modified or adversely modified or destroyed. And so each of those things was intended to, number one, make the act more effective. Number two, minimize the unneeded fighting about definitions and stuff that really has burdened the agencies for a long time. So that was our approach. The new administration would like to get rid of all of those changes. And so they've laid out a proposed rulemaking to do that. The other thing that we did at the very end of the administration is I utilized some policy authority that allows the secretary to exclude areas from critical habitat based on various factors. And we did that for the spotted owl, and they don't like that either. So they'll go through a process of working to undo these things. I'm hopeful that as they go through that process, they will find that in many of these instances, we worked very closely and harmoniously with the career staff, and they'll receive that advice. And I'm hoping that they don't do grave harm to the program going forward. We don't need unneeded conflict to conserve species. We all need to do everything we can appropriately to conserve species, but we don't need to fight about it unnecessarily.
Yeah, well said, and fingers crossed that that's the case as they proceed forward. Well, listen, I know you've been very generous with your time. Is there anything that you wanted to discuss that I haven't asked you about?
Well, I just think groups like yours and others need to keep working to provide the American people options for common sense solutions, help educate Americans, and the wonderful thing is, my takeaway from public service is the American people are blessed with an incredible amount of common sense, and they ultimately will demand that their policymakers find common sense solutions that move the country forward, and that's good for all of us in America.
Yeah, well said. And again, thank you for your time, Mr. Secretary. You can check out this will be recorded and posted at C3 Newsmag, as well as Facebook and our other social media accounts. So really appreciate the time today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your summer.